Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about Stoicism, and specifically about one of the most liberating teachings this ancient philosophy has to offer: how to stop caring about what others think of you. This is going to be a deep dive. We're going to explore not just the what and the how, but the why behind this ancient wisdom that could fundamentally transform how you experience life. Picture this. You're walking down a busy street, maybe rushing to an important meeting. You're checking your phone, not really paying attention, and suddenly, bang, you trip over an uneven sidewalk and go sprawling. Your papers scatter everywhere, your coffee spills, and for a moment, you're flat on the ground in front of dozens of strangers. What's the first thing that goes through your mind? If you're like most people, it's not, "Am I hurt?" or "Let me gather my things." No, the first thought is usually, "Oh God, everyone saw that. I look like such an idiot. They're all staring at me, judging me. They think I'm clumsy, unaware, probably late because I'm disorganized." This is going to replay in their minds for hours. This scenario, this moment of acute self-consciousness, reveals something profound about human nature and the source of much of our daily suffering. We are absolutely obsessed with what other people think of us, to the point where an imaginary audience in our heads can ruin our entire day, our week, sometimes even our entire self-concept. But here's what the Stoics discovered over 2,000 years ago, and what I want to share with you today. The judgment of others has no power over you, except the power you give it. The opinions of other people cannot hurt you unless you allow them to hurt you. And most of the time, and this is the part that will blow your mind, the judgments we're so terrified of don't even exist. Let me explain what I mean by that, because this insight alone could save you decades of unnecessary suffering. When you fell on that sidewalk, what do you think was really going through the minds of those passers-by? Were they really standing there thinking, "What a clumsy fool, what an embarrassment to humanity, I bet this person is a disaster in all areas of life"? Or were they more likely thinking about their own problems, their morning meeting that they're nervous about, their relationship issues that kept them up last night, what they're going to have for lunch, the text message they just received, the deadline they're worried about missing? The truth is, most people are so absorbed in their own lives, their own worries, their own internal monologue, that they barely register your existence, let alone form detailed judgments about your every move. But we project onto them this elaborate commentary about ourselves, and then we suffer because of opinions that exist only in our imagination. This is what Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher who was born a slave in ancient Rome, meant when he said, "What disturbs people's minds is not events but their opinion on events." The event is you falling down. The opinion, the judgment, the embarrassment, the shame, the elaborate narrative about what this says about your character, that's something you're adding to the event. That's something you're creating in your own mind. Now, before we go further, I want to acknowledge something. You might be thinking, "But people do judge, people do have opinions. I can see it in their faces, I can feel their eyes on me. This isn't just in my imagination." And you're not entirely wrong. People do form opinions, people do make judgments. But here's the crucial distinction the Stoics want us to understand. There's a massive difference between what people actually think and what we imagine they think. And there's an even bigger difference between what they think and whether what they think should have any power over our emotional state, our decisions, or our sense of self-worth. Let me take you back to your school days for a moment, because this is where many of us first learned to be afraid of judgment. Remember when you had to give a presentation in front of the whole class? For many of us, this was absolute torture. We'd stand up there, heart-pounding, palms sweating, voice shaking, convinced that everyone was scrutinizing our every word, noting every and cataloging every mistake, preparing to mock us the moment we sat down. But if you really think about it, if you remember what you were actually doing when other students were presenting, Were you really sitting there with a clipboard, taking notes on their failures? Were you forming detailed psychological profiles based on their presentation skills? Or were you mostly just waiting for your turn, thinking about the test next period, wondering what was for lunch, daydreaming about the weekend, or maybe even feeling sympathy for the presenter because you knew you'd be up there soon? The Stoics understood something fundamental about human nature. We are each the star of our own movie, the protagonist of our own internal drama. Everyone else is essentially a supporting character, background extras in the story of our lives. This isn't meant to sound harsh or cynical. It's just the reality of how consciousness works. Your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, your problems are the most real and immediate things in your experience. And here's the thing. You're a supporting character in everyone else's movie too. This isn't meant to be depressing. It's meant to be incredibly liberating. It means that the spotlight you think is constantly on you, analyzing and judging your every move, simply doesn't exist. Most people are far too busy being anxious about their own performance, their own problems, their own concerns, to spend much time evaluating yours. But let's dig deeper into why we care so much in the first place. Why are we so desperate for approval? Why does the opinion of strangers, people who don't know us, don't understand our context, don't have any real insight into who we are, why do their imaginary judgments have such power over us? Part of the answer is evolutionary. For most of human history, being rejected by the group literally meant death. If the tribe cast you out, you didn't survive. There were predators, harsh weather, no reliable food sources for a lone individual. So we developed this intense, primal need to belong, to be accepted, to avoid doing anything that might make the group turn against us. This was once a legitimate survival mechanism, hardwired into our brains through millions of years of evolution. But here's the problem. We're no longer living in small tribes where rejection means death. We're living in a world of billions of people, where being disliked by one person or even one group has virtually no impact on our actual survival or well-being. Yet our brains are still running on this ancient software, treating every potential judgment as if it's a matter of life and death. The other part of this puzzle is what psychologists call the looking glass self, the idea that we see ourselves reflected in how we think others see us. We use other people's opinions as a mirror to determine our own worth. If they think we're smart, we feel smart. If they think we're attractive, we feel attractive. If they think we're interesting, we feel interesting. We've outsourced our self-esteem to anyone who happens to be in our vicinity. This is what the Stoics saw as a fundamental error, a category mistake that leads inevitably to misery. We've made our self-worth dependent on external validation, which means we've given away our power to anyone who happens to be looking in our direction. We've made ourselves slaves to the opinions of others, including people we don't respect, people who don't know us, people whose judgment we wouldn't value in any other context. Marcus Aurelius, who was literally the most powerful man in the world as Roman emperor, understood this deeply. He wrote in his personal journal, which we now know as Meditations, "Remember that very little disturbs us. It's our opinion about things that disturbs us." Think about that for a moment. Here's a man who had genuine, practical reasons to care about public opinion. His political survival depended on it, the stability of the entire Roman Empire depended on it. And yet he understood that ultimately, what others thought of him could only affect him if he allowed it to. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is where the Stoic insight becomes truly revolutionary. Most of the judgments we're afraid of are not just overestimated in their importance. They're entirely imaginary. They exist only in our heads. Let me give you a concrete example that I bet you'll recognize. You're at a party, maybe a work event, maybe a social gathering. You're feeling a bit awkward because you don't know many people. You're standing by the food table, trying to look casual, when you reach for a glass of wine and accidentally knock it over. Red wine spills across the white tablecloth, and in that moment, time seems to stop. Immediately, your mind launches into overdrive. Everyone saw that. They all think I'm a clumsy idiot. They're judging me. They think I don't belong here, that I'm unsophisticated, that I can't handle myself in social situations. The host is probably annoyed. People are going to tell stories about this. I should just leave. I've embarrassed myself completely. But let's examine what actually happened. Maybe one person at the table noticed and thought, "Oh, that's unfortunate, I should grab some napkins," and then immediately went back to their conversation about their vacation plans. Maybe another person noticed and thought, "That reminds me of when I spilled coffee all over myself at that conference last month," and felt a moment of sympathy before getting distracted by the appetizers. Maybe a third person didn't even notice because they were engrossed in a conversation about their kid's soccer game. But in your mind, you've created this elaborate tribunal where everyone at the party has formed a committee to analyze your wine spilling incident, where they're all deeply concerned with this momentary accident, where they're forming detailed opinions about your character, your competence, your worthiness to be at this gathering based on one tiny mishap. You've become the defendant in a trial that exists only in your imagination. You're suffering because of judgments that were never made by people who weren't paying attention to an event they'll forget in 30 seconds. This is what I mean when I say we're responsible for our own suffering when it comes to judgment. We create the very judgments we're afraid of, and then we suffer because of our own creation. We're like someone who builds a prison, locks themselves inside, and then complains about being trapped. The Stoics had a sophisticated understanding of this psychological process. They called these automatic thoughts impressions, the initial mental pictures or ideas that pop into our consciousness when something happens. But they made a crucial distinction between the initial impression and our judgment about that impression. You can't control the first thought that appears in your mind when you spill wine on yourself. That's just how the brain works. It automatically generates interpretations, predictions, and explanations for events. But you absolutely can control what you do with that thought. You can examine it, question it, choose whether to believe it or dismiss it. Epictetus taught his students a practice he called discipline of assent, essentially learning to examine their impressions before accepting them as true. He would tell them, when an impression appears in your mind, don't immediately accept it. Instead, ask, is this thought true? Is this opinion I'm imagining actually real? And even if it is real, does it matter? Does it change anything important about my life or my character? Let's work through this with our wine spilling example. First question, is this thought true? Are people really forming detailed negative judgments about my character based on this spill? Well, let's think about it logically. How many times have you seen someone spill something at a party? Probably dozens of times. How many of those incidents do you remember? Probably none, unless it was particularly dramatic or funny. How much time did you spend thinking about the character flaws of the person who spilled something? Probably 0 seconds. So no, it's extremely unlikely that people are forming detailed judgments about you based on a minor accident. Most people either didn't notice, noticed and immediately forgot, or noticed and felt sympathy because they've been in the same situation. Second question, even if someone did form a negative judgment, does it matter? Let's say, worst case scenario, someone at the party actually did think, what a clumsy person, when you spilled the wine. So what? Does their opinion change who you are? Does it affect your actual worth as a person? Does it impact your life in any meaningful way? Does it change your relationships, your career, your health, your happiness, unless you let it? The answer to all of these questions is no. But we rarely stop to ask these questions. We just accept the initial impression, believe the imaginary judgment, and make ourselves miserable over something that probably didn't happen and definitely doesn't matter. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, because I hear this objection all the time. This is all very philosophical, but in the real world, other people's opinions do matter. I need my boss to think well of me to keep my job. I need my friends to like me to maintain relationships. I need my neighbors to respect me to live peacefully in my community. I can't just ignore what everyone thinks. And you're absolutely right. There are contexts where other people's opinions have practical consequences. The Stoics weren't advocating for complete social isolation or telling us to behave however we want without considering the impact on others. They weren't suggesting that we become sociopaths who genuinely don't care about anyone else. But here's the crucial distinction that most people miss. There's a massive difference between being aware of how your actions affect others and being controlled by fear of their judgment. There's a difference between adjusting your behavior for practical reasons and making your entire emotional state dependent on external approval. A Stoic approach to work performance might look like this. I want to do excellent work because it aligns with my values of competence and contribution. I want to create value for my organization because that's meaningful work. I want to be professional and collaborative because that makes the workplace better for everyone. The fact that this might also lead to positive recognition from my boss is a nice bonus, but it's not the primary motivation, and it's not something I can ultimately control anyway. Compare that to the non-Stoic fear-based approach. I need to do good work, because if I don't, my boss will think I'm incompetent, and then he might not like me. And if he doesn't like me, he might give me bad assignments. And if I get bad assignments, I might fail. And if I fail, he might fire me. And if he fires me, everyone will think I'm a failure, and I'll never get another good job, and my career will be ruined. Do you see the difference? In the first case, you're acting from your own values, your own understanding of what's worthwhile, and you're accepting whatever response comes. You're in control of your motivation and your actions. In the second case, you're acting from fear and making your peace of mind dependent on a chain of assumptions about someone else's approval. The Stoics called this fundamental principle the dichotomy of control, the distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us. Your work quality, that's up to you. Your effort, your attention to detail, your willingness to learn and improve, all of that is within your control. Your boss's opinion of your work, that's not fully up to you because his opinion is influenced by countless factors you can't control. His mood that day, his own pressures and deadlines, his personal biases and preferences, his relationship with his own boss, the company's financial situation, office politics you're not even aware of. When you make your emotional state dependent on something you can't fully control, you've essentially made yourself a slave to circumstances. You've given up your psychological freedom. But here's the beautiful paradox of the Stoic approach. When you stop being controlled by the fear of judgment, you actually become more effective, not less. When you're not constantly worried about what others think, you can focus all your energy on what actually matters, doing good work, being helpful, contributing value. When you're not paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes, you can take the intelligent risks necessary for growth and innovation. Think about the people you most admire, the leaders, the artists, the innovators, the entrepreneurs who have made a real difference in the world. What do they all have in common? They all had to be willing to be misunderstood, to be criticized, to have people disagree with them. If they had been controlled by the fear of judgment, they never would have accomplished anything significant. Steve Jobs was called crazy, arrogant, impossible to work with. Einstein was told his ideas were wrong by established scientists. Every great artist has been dismissed by critics who didn't understand their vision. Every successful entrepreneur has been told their idea would never work. The willingness to act despite potential judgment isn't just philosophically sound, it's practically necessary for any kind of meaningful achievement. But let's go even deeper into the psychology of judgment, because there are layers to this that most people never examine. One of the most insidious aspects of approval seeking is how it distorts our behavior in ways we don't even realize. When you're constantly worried about what others think, you start performing instead of being. You start curating a version of yourself that you think will be acceptable, likable, impressive. But this performance is exhausting, and it's also inauthentic. You lose touch with who you actually are underneath all the performance. I want you to think about this seriously. How much of your personality is actually yours, and how much is a performance designed to win approval? How many of your opinions are genuinely yours, and how many are just what you think your social group wants to hear? How many of your goals are based on what you actually want, and how many are based on what looks impressive to others? This is one of the most tragic consequences of living for others' approval. You lose yourself. You become so focused on being liked that you forget to become likable. You become so focused on being impressive that you forget to become excellent. You become so focused on avoiding judgment that you never develop the strength to handle it when it comes. The Stoics understood that authenticity was not just morally superior, it was also practically more effective. People are drawn to genuineness. They can sense when someone is performing versus when someone is just being themselves. The desperate need for approval is actually repelling because it puts pressure on others to constantly affirm you, and that's exhausting for them. But when you're genuinely indifferent to whether others approve of you, when you're comfortable in your own skin, when you say what you actually think, when you're not constantly seeking validation, you become much more interesting and attractive as a person. Paradoxically, not caring about being liked makes you more likable. This doesn't mean being rude, inconsiderate, or socially obtuse. It means being genuine. It means expressing your actual thoughts instead of saying what you think others want to hear. It means making choices based on your own values rather than what looks good to an imaginary audience. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. I have a friend who used to be completely controlled by what others thought. She would spend hours getting ready for any social event, agonizing over every detail of her appearance. She would rehearse conversations in her head, planning witty responses and interesting stories. She would carefully curate her social media to project the perfect image of success and happiness. But she was miserable. The constant performance was exhausting, and she felt like nobody really knew the real her because she had lost touch with who the real her actually was. She was so busy trying to be what she thought others wanted that she had forgotten what she wanted. Then she discovered Stoicism, specifically the teaching about indifference to others' opinions. At first, she was terrified. What if people didn't like the real her? What if she wasn't interesting enough without the performance? What if she was boring, awkward, ordinary? But she decided to experiment. She started small, wearing clothes that made her feel comfortable instead of clothes she thought looked impressive, speaking up with her actual opinions instead of just agreeing with whatever the group consensus seemed to be, sharing her real interests instead of pretending to be fascinated by things she didn't care about. What happened surprised her. People didn't run away. In fact, they seemed more drawn to her than before. Her friendships became deeper because they were based on who she actually was. Her dating life improved because she attracted people who were genuinely compatible with her real personality. Her work performance improved because she wasn't wasting mental energy on impression management. She discovered what the Stoics knew. The authentic self is always more compelling than the performed self. But let's address the deeper philosophical question here. Why should we care what the Stoics thought about judgment in the first place? What gives them any authority on this subject? Well, consider their track record. These weren't just armchair philosophers theorizing about life from a comfortable distance. These were people who lived through incredible challenges while maintaining their psychological freedom. Epictetus was born into slavery. He had no control over his external circumstances, no political power, no social status. His master could beat him, sell him, even kill him on a whim. If anyone had reason to be concerned about others' opinions, it was him. Yet he developed a philosophy that freed him completely from the tyranny of external approval. Marcus Aurelius was the opposite. He had ultimate power as Roman emperor. Every decision he made affected millions of people. He was constantly in the public eye, constantly subject to criticism and political pressure. If anyone needed to care about public opinion for practical reasons, it was him. Yet he wrote, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." Seneca was a wealthy advisor to emperors, someone who moved in the highest circles of Roman society. He understood firsthand how seductive the pursuit of status and approval could be. Yet he wrote, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. You are never too old to set another goal or to dream a new dream." These weren't people who lived in ivory towers. They lived in the real world, with real pressures and real consequences for their reputations. Yet they all discovered the same truth. Psychological freedom is possible regardless of external circumstances. And the key to that freedom is learning to be indifferent to others' judgments. Now, let me teach you some specific practical techniques the Stoics developed for breaking free from this prison of approval seeking. These aren't just abstract concepts. They're mental tools you can start using immediately. The first technique is what I call perspective taking. When you find yourself anxious about what someone thinks of you, force yourself to actually put yourself in their shoes. What are they really thinking about right now? What are their actual concerns and priorities? Let's say you're worried that your neighbor thinks you're lazy because your lawn isn't perfectly manicured. Instead of just sitting with that anxiety, actually think about your neighbor's life. Are they really spending time analyzing your lawn care habits? Or are they more likely thinking about their own problems, their work stress, their family issues, their health concerns, their financial worries? When you really consider it, you'll realize that your lawn probably doesn't even register on their radar of concerns. And if it does, what does that say about them? What kind of person has time to form detailed judgments about their neighbor's landscaping choices? I remember reading about a study where researchers asked people to estimate how much others would notice if they wore an embarrassing t-shirt to a party. The participants estimated that about half the people at the party would notice and remember the shirt. In reality, fewer than 25% of people even saw the shirt, and almost nobody remembered it afterward. We consistently overestimate how much attention others pay to us. The second technique is temporal perspective. Ask yourself, in a week, will this person remember whatever I'm worried about them judging? In a month? In a year? The answer is almost always no. The embarrassing moment that feels so significant to you right now will be completely forgotten by everyone else by tomorrow. The awkward thing you said in the meeting will be erased from everyone's memory by the next meeting. The social misstep you're obsessing over will never cross anyone else's mind again. This isn't just speculation. This is how memory actually works. Our brains are designed to forget most details, especially details that aren't personally significant to us. Your embarrassing moments are personally significant to you, so you remember them vividly. But they have no personal significance to anyone else, so they disappear from their memory almost immediately. The third technique is what Epictetus called other regarding discipline. Instead of asking, "What will they think of me?" ask, "What do I think of them for spending time judging others?" If someone is actually sitting around forming detailed negative opinions about strangers, what does that say about them? It says they have too much time on their hands and not enough going on in their own life. It says they're probably insecure and trying to feel better about themselves by criticizing others. It says they're living such a small, petty existence that they need to focus on other people's minor flaws to feel important. Is that really someone whose opinion you should value? Is that someone you respect enough to let their judgment affect your emotional state? The fourth technique is value clarification. Ask yourself, whose opinion actually matters to me and why? Make a list. Whose judgment do you actually care about? Is it the opinion of people you respect? People who know you well? People whose wisdom you trust? People who have your best interests at heart? Or is it the opinion of random strangers, co-workers you don't particularly like, people whose values you don't share? People who don't know anything meaningful about your life, your context, your challenges, your goals. Most of the time, when we examine this honestly, we realize we're making ourselves miserable over the imaginary opinions of people whose judgment we wouldn't actually value if we stopped to think about it. Your best friend's opinion of your life. Choices. That might be worth considering because they know you well and care about your well-being. A stranger's opinion of your appearance? Completely irrelevant because they don't know anything about you beyond the superficial. The fifth technique is response preparation. Instead of trying to prevent all judgment, which is impossible, prepare for how you'll respond when it comes. Accept that some people will misunderstand you, some people will disagree with you, some people will even dislike you. This isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're human and you're living an authentic life. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do?" Part of being human is dealing with other humans, and other humans sometimes have opinions you don't like. That's not a problem to be solved, it's just a fact to be accepted. The goal isn't to be universally loved, that's impossible and undesirable. The goal is to be true to your own values and let the chips fall where they may. But let me share with you what I think is the most powerful technique of all, what I call judgment jujitsu. Instead of trying to avoid judgment, learn to use it as information about the person doing the judging. When someone judges you harshly, they're revealing something about themselves, not about you. They're showing you their insecurities, their biases, their limited perspective. They're giving you insight into their character, their emotional state, their level of maturity. Someone who is quick to judge others is usually someone who is insecure about themselves. Someone who is critical and fault-finding is usually someone who is unhappy with their own life. Someone who feels the need to tear others down is usually someone who doesn't feel very good about themselves. This doesn't mean you should judge them back. That would just perpetuate the cycle. But you can use their judgment as a diagnostic tool. It tells you something about who they are and where they're coming from. And that information can help you decide how much weight to give their opinion. Now, let's talk about one of the most common objections I hear to this whole approach. But what about constructive criticism? What about feedback that could actually help me improve? If I stop caring about others' opinions, won't I miss out on valuable insights? This is an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of what the Stoics were actually teaching. They weren't advocating for complete indifference to all feedback. They were advocating for wisdom in determining which opinions deserve your attention and which don't. There's a big difference between constructive feedback from someone who knows what they're talking about and random judgment from someone who doesn't. There's a difference between specific, actionable advice aimed at helping you improve and vague criticism aimed at making someone else feel superior. A good rule of thumb: if someone's feedback is specific, actionable, and comes from a place of genuine care or expertise, it's worth considering. If it's vague, unhelpful, and seems motivated by their own emotional needs rather than your improvement, you can safely ignore it. Your tennis coach critiquing your serve technique, that's worth listening to, A stranger critiquing your choice of clothing? Not so much. Your mentor pointing out areas where you could develop professionally. Valuable feedback. A co-worker making snide comments about your personality. Irrelevant noise. The Stoics were big believers in wisdom and continuous improvement. Seneca wrote extensively about learning from others and seeking out good advice, but they also understood the difference between useful input and meaningless judgment. Another objection I often hear is, but if nobody cared what anyone thought, wouldn't society break down? Don't we need some social pressure to maintain civilization? Isn't judgment sometimes necessary to enforce social norms? This misses the point of what the Stoics were teaching. They weren't advocating for antisocial behavior or the complete abandonment of social norms. They weren't suggesting that we become sociopaths who genuinely don't care about the impact of our actions on others. They were advocating for internal freedom from the tyranny of approval seeking, while still choosing to behave ethically and considerately. You can choose to follow social norms because you see the wisdom in them, because they serve a practical purpose, because they make society function better, not because you're terrified of what people will think if you don't. You can choose to be kind, helpful, and considerate because these are virtues that contribute to human flourishing, not because you need people to like you. The difference is motivation. Are you acting from wisdom and virtue, or from fear and neediness? Are you being good because goodness is valuable, or because you want to be seen as good? Are you being considerate because consideration makes life better for everyone, or because you're desperate for approval? When your motivation comes from within, from your own understanding of what's right and valuable, you're much more likely to act consistently and authentically. You're more likely to do the right thing even when nobody's watching, even when there's no social pressure, even when it's difficult or costly. When your motivation comes from fear of judgment, you're likely to be inconsistent, performing differently for different audiences, never quite sure who you really are or what you really stand for. The Stoics believed that wisdom led naturally to virtue, and virtue led naturally to happiness. But you can't be truly wise if you're constantly distracted by what others think. You can't be truly virtuous if your actions are motivated by fear rather than understanding. And you can't be truly happy if your emotional state depends on the approval of others. This is why learning to stop caring about judgment is so fundamental to the Stoic path. It's not just about feeling more comfortable in social situations, though it will certainly help with that. It's about reclaiming your agency, your autonomy, your right to think your own thoughts and live your own life according to your own values. Let me tell you about the most profound shift that happens when you truly internalize this teaching. It's not just that you feel more confident or less anxious, though those are nice side effects. The real transformation is that you remember who you are. Most of us have spent so much of our lives performing for an imaginary audience that we've lost touch with our authentic selves. We've been so busy trying to be what we think others want us to be that we've forgotten what we actually want to be. When you stop caring about judgment, you have the space and freedom to rediscover your genuine interests, your real values, your authentic personality. You can finally answer the question, who am I when I'm not trying to impress anyone? This process of self-discovery can be both exhilarating and terrifying. It's exhilarating because you finally get to be yourself without apology. It's terrifying because you might discover that the real you is different from the performed you in ways that surprise you. Maybe you'll discover that you're more introverted than you thought, and that you actually prefer small gatherings to big parties. Maybe you'll discover that you're more creative than you realized, and that you've been suppressing artistic impulses because they didn't seem practical or impressive. Maybe you'll discover that you have strong opinions about things you've never felt free to express. This journey of self-discovery is one of the great rewards of psychological freedom, but it requires courage, because it means giving up the safety of conformity and the comfort of approval-seeking. The ancient Stoics had a profound understanding of what we now call psychological freedom. They recognized that external circumstances, including other people's opinions, could only imprison you if you allowed them to. Your mind is the one space that is completely yours, the one domain where you have absolute sovereignty. When someone judges you, they're not doing something to you. They're doing something in their own mind, in their own internal experience. Their judgment exists in their consciousness, not yours. It only enters your consciousness if you invite it in, if you dwell on it, if you make it important to you. This is perhaps the most radical insight of Stoicism. You are the gatekeeper of your own mind. You decide what gets in and what doesn't. You decide what matters and what doesn't. You decide what affects you and what doesn't. Epictetus, remember, was a slave for much of his life. He had no control over his external circumstances, no political power, no social status. His master could beat him, sell him, move him wherever he wanted. But Epictetus understood that he had complete control over his own thoughts, his own values, his own responses to whatever happened to him. He was freer in chains than most people are, with every external advantage. Why? Because he understood that freedom isn't about external circumstances, it's about internal sovereignty. It's about being the master of your own mind. This is the promise of Stoicism. Complete psychological freedom, regardless of your circumstances. The opinion of others becomes just another external event, like the weather. You notice it. You might take practical steps to deal with it if necessary, but you don't let it determine your internal state. Imagine what your life would look like if you truly didn't care what others thought of you. What would you try? What would you say? How would you dress? What career would you pursue? What hobbies would you take up? What boundaries would you set? What risks would you take? Most of us have spent so much of our lives in the prison of approval-seeking that we can barely imagine what freedom would feel like. But I want you to try. I want you to envision a version of yourself that is completely comfortable in your own skin, completely indifferent to the opinions of others, completely free to be authentic. That person isn't a fantasy. That person is who you really are underneath all the performance and fear. That's who you were before you learned to be afraid of judgment. That's who you can be again. Let me share some specific areas where this transformation typically shows up, so you can recognize the signs of progress. Social situations. Instead of scanning the room to see who's looking at you and what they might be thinking, you're actually present in conversations. You say what you really think instead of what you think people want to hear. You ask questions you're genuinely curious about instead of questions you think make you sound smart. Work environment. You speak up in meetings when you have something valuable to contribute instead of staying silent because you're worried about saying something wrong. You take on challenging projects because they interest you, not because they'll make you look good. You set boundaries around your time and energy instead of saying yes to everything out of fear of disappointing people. Creative expression. You pursue hobbies and interests that genuinely appeal to you, even if they're not cool or impressive. You share your creative work without agonizing over whether people will like it. You experiment and take risks because the process is more important than the outcome. Relationships. You attract people who actually like you for who you are, instead of people who like your performance. Your friendships become deeper because they're based on authenticity rather than mutual impression management. You're more attractive to potential romantic partners because confidence and authenticity are inherently appealing. Decision-making. You make choices based on your own values and priorities, not on what looks good to others. You're willing to Be misunderstood in service of doing what you think is right. You don't need consensus or approval to move forward with your plans. Self-expression. You dress in a way that makes you feel good, not in a way that you think others will approve of. You express opinions that are genuinely yours, even if they're unpopular. You're comfortable taking up space and being seen because you're not afraid of being judged. But perhaps most importantly, you stop judging others the way you used to judge yourself. When you're no longer afraid of judgment, you stop being judgmental. You realize that everyone is just trying to figure life out. Everyone is dealing with their own insecurities and challenges. Everyone deserves compassion rather than criticism. This shift in how you see others is one of the most beautiful aspects of psychological freedom. When you're not constantly worried about being judged, you have mental space to actually see other people clearly, to have empathy for their struggles, to appreciate their unique qualities. Now, let me address the practical question. How do you actually implement this? How do you start to break free from a lifetime habit of seeking approval and fearing judgment? The Stoics were very practical people. They didn't just offer abstract philosophy, they developed specific exercises and practices for training the mind. Here are some techniques you can start using immediately. Daily reflection practice. Every evening, spend a few minutes reviewing your day. Ask yourself, how many times did I modify my behavior out of fear of what others might think? How many times did I say something I didn't really mean because I thought it would be well received? How many decisions did I make based on how they would look to others rather than what I actually wanted? Don't judge yourself for these moments, just notice them. Awareness is the first step to change. Exposure exercises. Deliberately do small things that might invite judgment, starting with very low-stakes situations. Wear a shirt you love, but worry others might think is weird. Speak up with an unpopular opinion in a casual conversation. Try a new hobby that you're interested in, but think others might find silly. The goal isn't to be controversial or difficult. It's to build your tolerance for potential disapproval and prove to yourself that nothing terrible happens when people don't approve of you. Opinion auditing. Make a list of whose opinions actually matter to you and why. Include only people whose judgment you genuinely respect. People who know you well, care about your well-being, and have wisdom or expertise relevant to the area they're commenting on. Then, when you find yourself worried about someone's opinion, check whether they're on your list. If they're not, remind yourself that their opinion is irrelevant to your life. Perspective exercises. When you're worried about judgment, force yourself to think about what that person is actually focused on. What are their real concerns, challenges, and priorities? How much mental space do they actually have to think about you? Usually, you'll realize that your concerns barely register on their radar of important things to think about. Value clarification. Spend time getting clear on your own values, independent of what others might think. What do you actually care about? What kind of person do you want to be? What principles do you want to guide your decisions? When you have a strong internal compass, external opinions become much less relevant. You can evaluate feedback based on whether it helps you live according to your values, rather than whether it makes others happy. Judgment reframing. When someone does judge you, practice seeing it as information about them rather than about you. What does their judgment reveal about their biases, insecurities, or limited perspective? What does it tell you about their character or emotional state? This isn't about judging them back. It's about understanding that their judgment is more about their internal world than about objective reality. Response preparation. Instead of trying to prevent all judgment, prepare standard responses for when it happens. Practice phrases like, "I see it differently," "That's an interesting perspective," or simply, "Okay." without feeling the need to defend yourself or change the subject. The goal is to respond from a place of calm confidence rather than reactive defensiveness. Success redefinition. Change how you define success. Instead of measuring your worth by how much people approve of you, measure it by how authentic you're being, how well you're living according to your values, how much you're growing and contributing. This shift in metrics completely changes the game. Instead of trying to win approval, you're trying to win at being yourself. But I want to be clear about something. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. Breaking free from the approval-seeking habit is like recovering from any other addiction. It takes time, patience, and consistent practice. You'll have setbacks. There will be days when you catch yourself desperately seeking approval. Days when a random comment from a stranger ruins your mood. Days when you find yourself performing instead of being authentic. This is normal and expected. The key is to be patient with yourself while staying committed to the process. Every time you choose authenticity over approval seeking, you're strengthening that muscle. Every time you respond to judgment with equanimity rather than defensiveness, you're building psychological resilience. The Stoics understood that developing wisdom and virtue was a lifelong practice, not a destination you arrive at once and for all. They called themselves students of philosophy, even after decades of study and practice, because they understood that growth never stops. Marcus Aurelius was probably the most powerful person in the world during his lifetime, yet his personal journals are full of reminders to himself about basic Stoic principles. Even he needed constant reinforcement of these ideas, constant practice in applying them, so be patient with yourself. Celebrate small victories. Notice when you're making progress, even if it's gradual. And remember that every moment is a new opportunity to choose freedom over fear, authenticity over performance, wisdom over the desperate need for approval. The ancient Stoics found this freedom over 2,000 years ago, in a world that was often more brutal and unforgiving than ours. They proved that it's possible to maintain your integrity, your peace of mind, and your authentic self, regardless of external circumstances. They showed us that psychological freedom isn't dependent on having perfect circumstances or universal approval. It's dependent on understanding what you can and can't control and choosing to focus your energy on what's actually up to you. That same freedom is available to you right now. Not someday, when you're more confident or more successful, or more whatever. Right now. The only thing standing between you and complete psychological freedom is your willingness to stop giving away your power to people who probably aren't even paying attention. The judgment of others is not a law of nature. It's a choice you make. You can choose to let it control you, or you can choose to be indifferent to it. You can choose to live for the approval of others, or you can choose to live according to your own values and wisdom. The Stoics made their choice over 2 millennia ago. They chose freedom. They chose authenticity. They chose to be the masters of their own minds rather than slaves to others' opinions. What will you choose? Thank you.